between research and the general public and make sure that, everybody knows the good work that you all do and why it's important to continue funding that. So yeah, just to start, I'll introduce myself and give a little bit of background, but maybe in the chat, if you guys don't mind, also just letting me know like where you're at, maybe what you're researching, if there's something you're excited about, just to get to know you a little bit as well. And yeah, like Tyson said, I'm a freelance journalist and writer, and I've been a journalist for over a decade now, about half of that time as a freelancer. And I have done a lot of writing, reporting, as well as some editing, fact checking, sort of anything to do with journalism I've done. I've also written on topics across the board, including education. And as I understand, all of you are education scholars of some kind. And I worked with Cara and several other scholars at The Conversation for a time, editing for their education desk. So, in that role, I was doing that as a freelancer, so it wasn't full time, but yeah, I got to know a little bit more about like the kind of work that scholars do and how that might translate into, mostly like op-eds, but ways to get their research out into the public. It was a great learning experience for me, and I think for the scholars as well, because typically these two groups don't get to work together quite that closely. Um, and also, a little bit more about my background. I do have a master's degree that was sort of a dual program, so that was in journalism and Latin American studies. So while I've not written any academic papers, I do have a little experience in academic writing, and so I know the differences between both kinds, and can pretty confidently say that neither of them is easier than the other. They're just different. You're writing for different audiences. And I think if you know how to write, you can definitely write for the general public, but there's several things that you kind of need to switch in your mindset when you're thinking about that. And I'm sure Kara can definitely speak about that later when she talks about her experience with the conversation as well. Um, and yeah, I want to ask also, you can throw this in the chat or raise your hand, whatever's easier for you, but I'm just curious if anybody has had any of their work published in a non-academic outlet. So that could be like a newspaper or a news outlet or a blog, anything where you're writing for the general public. If you have, let me know, even maybe post the link in the chat if you have it handy. Okay, I see one person already, a couple people. Um, yeah, that's great. So there's some of you have some experience in this already. And I imagine that some people haven't done that, but if you're here, you probably are interested in doing that. Um, and then, yeah, another show of hands, maybe if anyone has been interviewed by a journalist before. So maybe you didn't write the piece, but your name appeared in an article. I see Cara. I'm not sure if anyone else has. Um, yeah, that's another way to kind of, oh, they were seeing some more. Awesome. So yeah, that's another great way to, get your work out there. But of course, you have a little less control over, what's eventually published. But I think those are the two like principal ways for scholars and researchers like you all to get your work out there. And if you haven't been interviewed, you haven't been published, I think the easiest way to get out there is to start writing on your own. Don't wait passively for a journalist to contact you. If your name isn't really out there outside of academic circles, it probably, they probably won't know who you are and they won't be able to contact you. But if you've got a nice op-ed, something in the conversation, you're much more likely to start hearing from people, which is exciting. Um, and then the last question I have here before I start jumping into tips and things that I have is a question that I want you all to kind of keep in mind throughout this presentation, and I'll ask it again at the end. But I think, the most important thing to remember when you're thinking about writing for a general audience is to ask the question of like, what from your research do you want people to know? It's a very simple question, but it's kind of hard to answer. And the answer can't just be like, I want them to know about this paper I wrote. It has to be more specific, much more of a statement, maybe one specific finding, or something that even when you're talking to your friends and family, you think everybody should know, about this concept in education, and they don't. So maybe that's the thing you want people to know about. But that's kind of the guiding question that I think will help anyone if they're interested in writing a piece to kind of know what they should be writing about and also how to, essentially sell that to the editor and then the audience. So if you have an answer, feel free to throw that in the chat. But otherwise, just keep it in mind and think about that as we talk through this presentation. Um, and then I guess a sort of part two of that question I should mention is, I said, what do you want people to know that comes from your research, something you know from your research that you want other people to know. You also need to figure out who people are. So that could be every American. It can be abroad. It could be teachers or students, voters, parents. It could be your own parents, your own neighbors. Kind of identifying who your audience is before you even start writing a single sentence is also key. So those are two kind of main questions that we'll come back to throughout. Um, and I'm going to start by sharing a couple of slides here. So let me figure out how to share my screen. Um, Hold on, give me 1 second here to pull up my presentation. I'm kind of new with Google Slides, so I got to figure out how to start that. There we go. Okay, I'm gonna share that. Okay, and can you all see the screen? Okay. Awesome. So let's see. Oh, sorry, 1 sec here. I lost my notes. Hold on. Okay. So I'm going to start with, do you all see the screen with the Hechinger report piece? Yeah, okay. I'm going to start just giving you guys some examples that I found that were pretty recent and I think are good examples of ways that education scholars, researchers, people who work in that field have written. So there's many different types, but just for the sake of simplicity, I've broken it down into a couple of like broad categories. One being like education trade outlets. So the Hechinger report, if you're all familiar, that would be one of them. Other ones are like Chalkbeat, there's Education Week, EdSurge, any of those outlets that have ed in the name, those are typically education trade outlets, and many of them accept op-eds. They may call it guest essay or first person piece, opinion piece. They use different names, but essentially they're all like op-eds. So that's probably the word I'll use throughout this just for the sake of simplicity. But here's one that's written by a Jeremy Rochelle. I do not know him, but I thought this was a nice piece that he wrote about conflicting messages about AI and basically what educators should do or know about that. And here in the corner in the red box, I just highlighted a sentence that was a little bit further down in the piece towards the top, but it just didn't fit in my screenshot there. But it sort of shows like, Jeremy putting his expertise like high up in the piece and why he should be the person to write this story. So as you can see, he wrote, "What should responsible educators do?" As a learning scientist who has been involved in AI since the 1980s and who conducts nationally funded research on issues related to reading, math, and science, I have some ideas. Um, and just from that, those two sentences there, you can see like this piece is not necessarily about like all the research he's done, but he's going to weave it into the piece and about a topic that I think everybody is talking about in education and otherwise, which is AI. And so that's a great way to kind of get your research in there. He's not writing about a study he did, but he's using what he knows and all of the research he's done since the 80s to inform the public about something we're already talking about. So that's one example. Another broad category would be like mainstream news outlets. So let's see. Here's another example. This is from the Washington Post. Mainstream outlets, are as big as that, the New York Times, but also like your local newspapers. That's a great place to kind of start the conversation, especially if you have an issue that's really important in your town or where you live. But this piece, as you can see, the headline is There is no reading crisis in the US. Here's what's really happening. And that's written by Paul L. Thomas. As you can see, he's a professor of education, and he's also written a book about the reading war. Certainly, you don't have to have written a book to write for something like the Washington Post, though it does help. So later, when I talk about, how you get into these outlets, if you have written something big, you definitely want to mention that. As you can see, they put it right at the top of the piece there. Um, and yeah, the part that I wanted to highlight here in the piece, in the red box, is where he says, each of these statements about student reading achievement, though probably well-meaning, is misleading, if not outright false. There is no reading crisis in the US, but there are major discrepancies between how the federal government and states define reading proficiency. So you can see from that, this is someone who has expertise, has probably done research about, how the federal government and states define reading proficiency. Which if he just led with that sentence, it sounds a little boring and dry. And when you're writing for other academics, that's perfectly fine. When you write for the general public, you got to bring them into that. So I think he did a great job in this piece by kind of immediately talking about the reading crisis, which has been in the news. We all know, especially since the pandemic, like it's been news for the general public that reading scores and math scores are dropping. So he starts with that and then kind of again weaves his research in. And then a third category, which isn't exactly a category, but I'm going to include it as one for this presentation. But so this is Cara's piece that I worked with her on in the conversation. And I'm putting it in its own category because it is a unique outlet. They only publish stuff from scholars. They don't necessarily call these pieces op-eds, and sometimes editors there will say they don't want it to be too opinionated or they don't want it to go too much into op-ed territory, but I would argue that, I mean, they kind of are op-eds. It's written by one person who has expertise on a topic and is usually like, making some kind of statement that they're backing up. Any good op-ed is going to do that anyway. And yeah, I'm going to use Cara's piece as an example throughout this, just to kind of show you different ways that you can, hit the key points that you need in an op-ed in order to be noticed by the editor and then, of course, to be read by readers. And then lastly, this isn't really a category, but I'm going to show you a couple bonus pieces that, unfortunately, in this day and age, another way to get your research out there is to talk about like the news of funding cuts to research. Hopefully this isn't something that we'll have to deal with forever, but we all know this year there's been a ton of cuts, especially in education, especially in research, universities. And so I actually helped someone else I worked with at the conversation to write this next piece here. This appeared in Newsweek, and this was someone who was part of a team that was like actively doing research on STEM education. The grant was cut, in the middle of the project there, and so she wanted people to know like why it's important to continue this research. And I think even at the end, there's like a call out for people to call their Congress people. And so that's a different type of op-ed you could think about writing if this has happened to you. I hope it's not happened to any of you, but of course, in that case, you should consider getting the word out about why your research is important, why the funding should continue. And then here's just one more example I found. This is in Chalkbeat, very similar piece about written by an early childhood education researcher and talking about government efficiency and why it's not actually efficient when it comes to her work. So those are a couple of examples. I know I'm talking kind of fast, but I guess just to recap, maybe the sort of broad categories I'm looking at here are like trade publications where they write specifically about education, mainstream outlets, the big ones that Washington Post, New York Times, is USA Today, as well as like local newspapers, magazines. And then something like The Conversation, which I think is just a great entry point for a lot of people who want to write about their research. So those are kind of the large categories. And as far as how to decide which one you want to write for, I mean, that's really a personal decision. There's not one right or wrong answer. But going back to the question I asked in the beginning about who you want your audience to be, um, that's the main thing to keep in mind when you're thinking of who you want to pitch an op-ed to. If you want it to be like a really general public, then consider a mainstream outlet or local newspaper. Um, but if, what you research or what you really want people to know is something that's kind of in the weeds, and maybe if you really just want educators to know, I would not consider the mainstream outlets first. I would probably go straight for the trade outlets. So you want to go for reach, but you have to know like what kind of audience these publications have. If you want to make sure that you are having a good chance for success to land your pitch, you have to kind of know what the outlet audience is and what you want your audience to be and try to align that. Um, and a couple of other things to consider too, how timely is the op-ed that you want to write? I think probably for most of you, a lot of them are maybe more evergreen topics and that they are relevant now, but it's not, there's not like one news event that kind of makes your research relevant. If that is the case, that it's like directly tied to something happening in the news, you have to be prepared to work very quickly. This is something that I think is very challenging for scholars because it's a pace you're probably not used to working at when it comes to publishing, and also you're just busy. But editors tend to be fast, especially if something is newsworthy. And so if you do want to publish something like that and you want it to be in like a local newspaper, I would say, think hard about where you want to publish it because you don't want to waste your time pitching to multiple outlets. You want to kind of go straight to the one that will respond most quickly and then be ready to respond to edits or whatever they may ask right away. The news is still very much a fast-paced business, even for op-eds, unless you're doing something that has a little bit more relevance, like for the longer term, which I would probably encourage. It's just easier, especially if you're a first-timer. And then let's see, next, I'd like to talk about just some general tips that I learned from working with other scholars. Like, what are the sort of pitfalls that they tended to fall into at the conversation and how to maybe avoid that. So first, this one I think is kind of funny, but it came up so many times when I was editing pieces there. You're all used to doing lit reviews and like the papers that you write, and I know it's crucial for academic work. But it really gets in the way of, a good piece when you're writing for the general public. People just don't usually need to know that information. And their attention spans are short. As you know, like a typical op-ed is, maybe it's like 800 words or something, much shorter than an academic paper. So you also you don't want to waste the words you have. And you want to just let people know, like, what do they need to know about your research now? It's obviously helpful for you to know the history of research on a specific topic. But I would say that's one area that if you're writing a draft of something and you go back and read it, you can probably cut anything that looks or sounds like a lit review. That happened a lot when I was editing for the conversation, and I understand why scholars do that, but that's one thing to keep in mind. Um, and sort of related to that is you want to make sure you get directly to the point. This is a tip for any writer. I think every writer of every kind struggles with this. I myself have a lot, and that's kind of why we have editors as well. But when you're writing, you can think about it too. Whatever point you're trying to make, you want it to appear basically in the first paragraph, like the second paragraph at the latest, I would say. And you can see in some of these examples I shared, which I can share the links to these afterwards in the chat if that helps. But basically in the first like couple of sentences, we're straight to the point. So you want to make sure you're doing that as well. And then I'm going to show I'm going to go back to Cara's piece in the conversation because I think she did a really good job in this one of covering some of the main points. So another thing is that you want to make sure you're writing for a general audience and not other academics. That might sound obvious, but I think it's really hard to remember when you're writing, especially if you're not used to that. And so a good way to do that is to kind of scan your piece, your writing, and see how many times you use like jargon. You don't generally want to use that at all when you're writing for the general public. If you can describe what something means instead of using the word, that's what you should do. And again, I know this is a lot easier said than done. But that's like a surefire way to not get your pitch accepted is if you like reach out to an editor and it's full of jargon. It might be impressive to like an academic editor, but it just isn't to a journalism one, and they probably won't know what it means anyway, and they're not going to take the time to look it up. Um, and so in Cara's piece, for example, so hers was about teaching with fidelity, which that is kind of a jargon word. In this case, I don't think there was a way to not use that word at all because the whole piece was about that. So there are, exceptions where you might need to use some, and depending on what audience you're writing for, you can get away with it a little bit. But I think that what we came up with to kind of get around that in this piece was like immediately defining what that means. Um, and like for me, for example, I've written about education, but I haven't like studied it. I don't have a degree in that, and I didn't know what that meant. And so, she described it to me, and together I think we kind of worked out this opening paragraph where we define what is fidelity in education and then give some examples. So you can see there in that second sentence. Like that might mean a teacher reading from a script or being required to use a certain tone or expression or teaching from a designated page in a guidebook on a specific day. So right away, anyone reading this, whether or not they have a background in education, knows what that means and they can kind of even like envision it. So I think these examples were really strong there in that first paragraph. Um, and if you're kind of struggling with how you might define something that's jargon, ask yourself that age-old question of like how you would describe it to a fourth grader. If you have kids, how would you describe it to them? Even your parents, if they don't work in your field, like how would you describe to them what this means or what you do, in your research? Um, that's a good way to think about it. And I guess also going back to fourth graders, just a sort of general guide when it comes to writing these pieces is like, what did you learn about writing when you yourself were in fourth grade? Um, for most of us, that was probably like a 5-paragraph essay. Very simple, pretty, straightforward structure. You probably will be writing more than 5 paragraphs, but that structure really works pretty well for shorter pieces. So if you're kind of struggling on where to start and how to do this, and you don't want to get carried away in the lit review, just remember that you're going to start with whatever your thesis is, whatever point you want to make. Give some, let's say 3 or so examples of to back up that point, and then conclude. Um, I remind myself of things like that all the time in my writing too, because it's easy to get bogged down. In your case, especially because you know so much and you really can't put everything in this piece. So just try to simplify as much as you can. Um, and then another extremely important part of writing for the general public is to remember or identify why you're writing this right now. This is main question in the news. And for most of you, if you're going to be writing a piece, you want it to be in some sort of a news outlet. So you need to, it doesn't have to be something extremely urgent, but you have to kind of tell the audience, tell the editor, like why this is something that needs to be published today. Sometimes that's obvious. Again, if there's like a news event directly tied to your research, great. That's really easy to answer that question. Love when that happens. But oftentimes it doesn't, and that doesn't mean you can't write about it, but you might have to think a little bit harder to connect your research to something that's sort of in the news or, in discussion today. And so Cara's piece here is a good example of that. There was no like news story about teaching with fidelity, but as you can see in the second paragraph, sort of in the middle, she writes, today, policymakers commonly suggest that fidelity is synonymous with good teaching. And unfortunately, that link is broken as I was checking while I was preparing for this presentation, as it's a government link. So it no longer goes to the page it used to, but it was Cara reminded me that it was like a Head Start claim. And so you can see right there, that's not really a news story, but she's saying like policymakers are talking about this issue, and we as voters vote for these people. So it gives it like a sense of urgency and tells readers very early on in the piece, like why we should care about this right now. And then another question, I've alluded to this in the other pieces I shared, but you also need to identify why you are the right person to talk about this. So right there in the third paragraph, Cara says she's a former elementary school teacher and now studies how teachers make ethical decisions. So it's short and succinct, but it gives the reader, what they need to know about like, why they should trust you or why your opinion here matters. And is kind of an entryway into the research and the work that you do. Um, Something that I've seen people do sometimes is try to fit a little bit too much in there. You want to remember to share just what's important for the reader to know. Like if Cara, for example, was also like a former school bus driver or something, that doesn't really have a place in this piece, even if it's important to her. You have to, remember to tell people who you are that's like in service to the op-ed that you're writing. Yeah, just make that one simple, I would say, but it should definitely be in there and fairly high up in the piece usually. Um, and then, yeah, a couple of times I know I've mentioned pitching. I'm not sure if you all know what that means or what a pitch is in journalism, but it's essentially if you want to write an op-ed, usually you'll be writing a pitch before the actual piece. So that means you're deciding what outlet you might want to write for. You find an editor or you find like usually they have a page on their website that has pitch guidelines or they might call it like submissions or something along those lines. And they'll tell you like who to email and they'll ask for a pitch. And that's typically just like one paragraph, maybe two, pretty short, sort of explaining like what piece you want to write and why. And then from there, if they accept it, you'll work with that editor to write the full piece. Probably you'll write a draft next and then they'll edit it, but it sort of depends on the outlet on how they manage that. Um, and a pitch really, it has to include all of the stuff that I've been talking about, like essentially why you should be the person to write it, why this is important right now, and what the point is. But it's just abbreviated, so that can be a little bit hard. You're writing even shorter than you would for the actual piece, but essentially it's the same elements. And Cara actually shared the pitch that she wrote for the conversation with me, which I thought was a good one, and I just highlighted a couple of those things there. Um, and the conversation, they have like an actual form, I think, that you fill out with different fields you fill in. Oftentimes you're just emailing someone and it won't have all of that, but I just took screenshots from parts of hers. And you can see like right there, she immediately says like she's writing about fidelity and that it impacts children in the profession in a negative way. She comes right out and says that right away. She mentions the current and very public drama about the reading wars. That kind of answers like why people should care and why should they care now. And then also identifies herself as a former teacher and professor of education. Um, and you can see here she's included some pieces that she's written like academically. If you have written before, if you've written a book for sure, if you've written any other piece for publication for a general audience, you should definitely include that in a pitch. An editor is way more likely to say yes if they know you've written before, because for them it's sort of taking a chance. Like they know you can write for an academic audience, but they want to know that you can also write for a general audience. It makes their job a lot easier. So definitely link to that if you've done it. And if you haven't, don't worry about it. You don't have to. Everyone has to start somewhere. But just consider your pitch is kind of an example of how you can write for the general public. So you want to write it in the way that you plan to write the piece. Make it conversational. Don't have sentences that are so long and ongoing or really long paragraphs. If you can demonstrate in a couple of paragraphs in a pitch that you know how to write conversationally, that will go a long way, even if you haven't done that before and don't have like clips or whatever. Um, Let's see. And then, yeah, another thing I would say too when you're pitching and also just writing is to think about like a headline. This is a lot harder than it seems, and I think all journalists, all writers kind of struggle with this. There's really kind of an art to headline writing, and I'm not going to go way into it because it's even for me, I don't really know like how to explain the best way to do that. But if you're gonna email an editor a pitch, you definitely want to try to put some sort of a headline in the subject line. So like I would do something like op-ed pitch colon headline. And I think we often think that that's not that important, but especially if you're going to go for a larger outlet where there's a high volume of pitches, they may just delete it without even reading it. So if you can get something sort of catchy in that subject line that would make a good headline, that alone elevates your chances of getting chosen. And it also just kind of helps you figure out what it is you're writing about. It helps you focus your own thoughts, honestly. And even if you love your headline and you think it's great, like the editor probably will change it at some point. So it's not necessarily to be the final one, but it just kind of helps you really like hone in on your topic and also get noticed. And if you're not sure how to write them, just look at some examples online. I think the Washington Post does a good job with headlines generally. And I think their style has kind of like proliferated to a lot of other outlets. Um, and you can see, it's not like the old newspaper headlines anymore. Like you can usually make them a bit longer, which is easier for us as writers, but you just want it to be something that grabs people's attention. It sort of gets to like the relevance or the urgency of why you're writing right away. So like, yeah, if what you're writing has anything to do with the reading wars, as some of these examples I showed you did, like putting that in the headline helps, for example, within reason, like don't exaggerate things, but if there is something kind of punchy, get it out there right away, I would say. Um, and yeah, you'll find that some outlets too, instead of a pitch, they will ask that you just submit a full piece right away. Um, that really is just dependent on the outlet though and requires some research on your part, deciding who you want to write for and then looking up their guidelines. People have different, ideas for word count and all of that. And that's, there's some things in common with every outlet, but I would say before you get like too deep into writing a piece, be sure to check out some of these websites and see like what are their guidelines and how would you go about doing that. You don't want to write a whole draft only to find an editor that would like prefer you to write it in a wholly different way. So that's more just about saving your own time, I guess. Um, let's see. Okay, I think that covers what I wanted to say about pitching. And I just have a couple of resources I wanted to share here at the bottom of this. Um, I don't know if you're all familiar with the Op-Ed project. It's like an organization that helps not just scholars, but anyone who like wants to write an op-ed and get their voice heard. It just kind of coaches them on how to do that. I haven't worked for them. I don't know exactly how they run, but they have some resources on their website, including this one here, which I'll share in the chat afterwards as well, that has like a list of outlets. And I think they have like links to their like submission guidelines. So if you're kind of not sure where to start on pitching a piece, that list is pretty good. Um, I've also started developing my own list specifically for education scholars. It's a work in progress. It's not public, but of course, if anyone wanted to work with me, I would share that with them, and I'm adding to it actively. Um, it's sort of just like the homework aspect of doing all of this, but it does suck up a lot of time. So if you can find some resources like this that show you like how to pitch a certain place, that track down the email address of the editor for you, that helps a lot. And then I've also linked here to the conversations pitch guide just as an example, so you can see all of them look different. And I also by the way, for the conversation, I'm a freelancer, so I wasn't like directly employed by them. I don't know how they decide whose piece gets picked. Just for like a little background from what I heard from someone else is that, they do have like partnerships with certain universities. If your university is a partner, I mean, that's going to make it a lot easier for your pitch to be accepted, but anyone can pitch them. So I think there's probably some politics in deciding like whose gets chosen. I suppose that's true of everywhere, but it never hurts to try. So keep that in mind. And then here's just the key questions in case anyone wants to take a picture of that or save that. I can also share it in the chat afterwards. But the questions that I asked as I went through the different examples, I think these are the main ones that you want to keep in mind. And actually, if you could even answer all of these before you start writing, you'll be in a very good place to, think about a pitch and a topic and kind of be prepared to do it and not get bogged down in the details. So just to go over them one more time, that leading question is, what do you know based on your research that you want other people to know? Followed by, who are these other people? So defining your audience. Um, and then how does your research relate to what's going on in the news? Again, that's sometimes easier to answer than other times, but the more you can make a link there, the better. What would the headline of your op-ed be? Why is now the right time to publish it? And why are you the right person to write it? So those are the main questions there. Um, and then here, I can share this in the chat too. This is just my email address in case anybody does want to contact me, and my website. As Tyson said, I'm working with scholars. It's sort of a new offer for me this year, but based off of the work I did at the conversation, I realized that there was kind of a need, and I think a lot of people that aren't really feeling that need to connect journalism with research a little bit more. So if anyone's interested in working more directly with me, whether that's like editing or help coming up with a pitch, or even ghostwriting, I can do that as well. Feel free to reach out. And I think that is all I have in this presentation, so I can stop sharing here. Okay, yeah. Awesome. Oh, I see there's a lot in the chat here, so I don't know if there's if there were any questions in there specifically. If so, feel free to shout it out because I haven't read any of these comments.
Thanks, Colleen. That was very informative. I mean, it reminds me really about what good writing is. I want to use the idea of writing a pitch actually in my graduate writing seminar. I think it'd be a very helpful um, exercise for some of my students who are writing their dissertations to actually like distill the idea down to something, or even writing a headline for your own dissertation would be kind of fascinating as a writing exercise. But one thing I wanted to ask, and then I'm going to just facilitate, we'll open it up for other people to ask questions. I was kind of so as an academic, I'm used to this long, extended period of time between writing and publishing. It can
Mhm.
take, longer than a year. And it seemed to me that what you were saying is that there's a really rapid pace to this. And I'm just wondering, could you say more about that? Like if I pitch something, when am I expected then to write it? Does it happen immediately, or like is there a general rule here? Because I naively, if I would have done this before taking this seminar with you, I would have thought, oh, I pitched something and then I have months to develop the idea. But it sounds like I'm completely wrong.
Yeah, that's a good question and a huge difference between journalism and academia. It kind of depends on the outlet, I will say. It's not always rapid, which is frustrating because I would say you should expect that. And then sometimes you'll get an editor that like does not get back to you for forever, and then suddenly they do and they want you to respond right away. That's not exactly fair, but that happens sometimes. But I would say generally, like you should be ready to respond, like within a week. Especially if it's newsworthy. I mean, they might get back to you the same day if it's something they really want and they want to publish it soon. Um, and for something like an op-ed, I mean, it's not like an investigative journalism piece. It's not something very long. doesn't take like a ton of effort to edit it. So I would say most places will turn it around pretty quickly. So I think you should keep that in mind when pitching to make sure that like in case it's accepted that you have like a little bit of flexibility to write. And yeah, and of course, unfortunately, it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you need to follow up regularly. So I didn't mention that, but that's actually a really good tip. If you really want something to be published in, USA Today, and you email the editor and everything's good, and you don't hear for like a week, or if like even 2 days, if it's something that's very timely, you should follow up. And I mean, I myself, as a freelance journalist, like I've sometimes followed up like 3 times before I heard back. I would say you probably don't need to do more than that, but if it's something you really want, you can send a couple of different emails, and they're used to that. Like if it's really not timely at all, if it's a more evergreen story, like maybe wait a couple of weeks. But 1 week is fair, I think, because oftentimes editors will respond that quickly and they're not really offended if you follow up like that.
That's very helpful because, again, that's very different from the academic world. I mean, I could only imagine how angry journals would be if you were sending emails like a week after you had submitted something. Okay, let's open it up. Does anyone have other questions? You can pose them in the chat or just raise your hand and I will try to get to you. Okay, Larry, could you unmute, please?
I'm unmuted. Colleen, thank you so much. That was incredibly useful. I want to add, I'm involved in a project that's producing material for teachers who are teaching in a difficult situation, which these days, in some ways, is every teacher, but it's especially teachers in blue states that have curriculum suppression legislation, if I may call it that, inside this particular grouping. And I want to ask a kind of general question about writing in the Trump era a little bit. And um, the material I'm producing, the version that I've got for this website, it's going to actually go up in the next 2 weeks. It's on a website, and the website, has to sort of be for any teacher who wants to access it. But it is very contrary to what the administration wants to do with the world of education. And so I was a little bit wondering whether if I wanted, it really wasn't until I got this notice for this thing today that I even really thought about the op-ed thing because I've been so focused on getting the material ready for this other outlet. But then I just wondered whether it might be useful to have some form of it go in an op-ed form. And I was kind of like wondering, do you have any sense of whether you should in some way try to be kind of like nonpartisan and as neutral as you can be? Or do you really get out there with, this is horrible what these people are doing, and this is why, but without quite saying it that way? I don't know if it's something that has any kind of general answer to it, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I mean, that's something that journalists are grappling with, of course, those who are writing straight news. How much of that can you put in there? How much do you have a duty to put in there?
Yeah.
But I think in an op-ed you can say what you want. If you think what the Trump administration is doing is horrible and it directly impacts students and teachers in a negative way, um, you should say that. I don't think, an op-ed isn't the same thing as a news story, so you don't really need to try to be neutral. It's more just about your argument. I mean, I guess if you're going to make the whole thing like railing against the Trump administration, is that going to like help your argument or is that going to like turn people away from it? That depends on the audience that you're writing for. But I don't think that you need to shy away from that, especially if that's like the point, part of the point that you're trying to make. Oh, go ahead, Kara, too.
I was going to chime in because I think this relates to some feedback that you gave on my piece, and I've gotten from some other um, pieces, and I feel like it fits, Larry, with work you've done in the past and said. I wasn't supposed to do a full lit review for the conversation piece, but you did push me pretty hard to make sure I had empirical backing for everything. And I mentioned in the chat that, and mine was like an empirical piece. Some other people's is more conceptually argued, but um, I put in the chat that it was hard for me to do that because fidelity is widespread in teaching, but not actually acknowledged or written about. It's become such a norm. And so I really had to dig to find those dots. But the point being that it made it harder for somebody to sort of poke holes in what I was doing in a variety of ways because I had this sort of empirical stance. And so that's advice I've heard in other places too, to like make a point, but focus less on the floweriness of the point and more on just like the evidence is X and leave it at that. So that was helpful advice.
Can I come back at that, Cara? And this is for you, Colleen, as well. Are you saying a little bit that in this particular conjuncture we're in now, nailing down your back, the backing you have for what you're saying is actually important because things are so polarized and you want to protect yourself against various kinds of ways that people could dismiss you or that the outlet wouldn't, the outlet itself wants to have things nailed down more. Is that right?
That's what I felt, and not being sort of fast and loose in the ways that I think, I think Colleen, you gave me feedback like, well, we all know that, but like make sure that you actually say how we know that, even though we all sort of know it. Like, and I think as philosophers, this is a similar training, but really like boiling down in 850 words, like you really have to leave a lot out. So boiling it down to like, what is the most important thing? Like, what's the hill that I want to die on here? And then like the rest of it, I'll let go.
Yeah. I think it's a great point about bringing up the evidence too. And of course you can have an opinion on the Trump administration, and if that's part of your piece, you should do it. But as Kara said, you need to be able to back it up. And think about it, I suppose there are some similarities to like the lit review, but it's more of like a fact-checking thing than lit review, if that helps to kind of like change the mindset. Like adding links to your piece, everything is published online these days. Even if it goes in print, it's online. So you can add as many links usually as you want to. And sometimes that's all you need to do. You don't need to say more than just putting a link in there to say that, yeah, yeah, people are talking about this topic. Here's a link that to a news story even that shows that they are. So yeah, in that sense, because it is a journalism outlet, like you need to have evidence, you need to back up what you're saying. It has to be based in fact. But you can still have like an opinion on it. You don't have to do the both sides thing necessarily unless it's relevant. Not for an op-ed, at least.
I just have another, like, after that was a very profound question. My questions are just naive. So one other question, and I guess this came up from something you said, Colleen, but also something that Dave posted in the chat. And it seems like the relationship with the editor is really different from a traditional like academic journal. It seems like the editor has a lot more is almost like a co-writer, I think Dave said. And I'm just wondering, like, what should I prepare myself for? I mean, at what point do I do I say, wow, this is too many changes, or like how do you negotiate that with an editor, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good practical question. And there's not really one right way to do it. I mean, Kara can probably speak more to this or anyone else who's written and published pieces already, but um, I mean, they don't all work as intensely with you. It depends on the outlet. At the conversation, it's like very intensive. They have like a whole system, and you end up working with like three editors, I think, probably by the time you're done. Um, Oftentimes it's just one. Sometimes you'll publish something that what you turn in is more or less what they publish. That's kind of lucky. I like when that happens to me. It's easier for me as well because then you don't have to go back and forth so much. But others will have a bigger hand in it. And it's honestly, it's not even just dependent on the outlet. It's also sometimes on the individual editor on how much writing they like to do or how much control over the piece they want. Um, so I would say like approaching that, like let's say you do have an editor that wants to rewrite the whole thing. At the conversation, we often rewrote the whole thing, like more than once. You just have to decide like what you're comfortable with and make sure. I think Kara said like, you know, what hill do you want to die on? Like the same kind of is true with editors. Like I would say try to put your ego aside, but you know, if they're totally like bungling the point or they're getting the research wrong, I mean, definitely tell them that. And editors will because they're not trained and they don't have the background that you do as the writer. So I always tried to, I mean, I hope that Kara felt this with me, but I always tried to like make sure that the writers I worked with, like, you know, they were reading it closely when I rewrote something to like make sure that that was accurate. So I think it's you want to be able to work with them, like trust their expertise on like structure and even like language, the way that they write, but double check everything on like facts and things from from your research or others' research that they're using. Make sure that it's correct because a lot of editors will get that stuff wrong because they're just looking at it for, you know, an hour or 2 hours and they don't have years of experience and expertise like you do. I hope that answered your question.
Do we have time? 1 minute. Does anyone have a very short question?
I have a short question. Can you
Okay,
hear me
go.
okay? Um, what counts as research for general public?
I mean,
That's the short version.
yeah, I think anything that you are doing in your work could be written for the general public. I mean, if that's what you're asking, like anything that you would write an academic paper for it, you could write about for the general public. It's just a matter of, you know, figuring out like what piece of that will resonate. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I'm trying to keep my response short as well, but I'm happy to expand if you wanted to hear more.
I will follow up and expand.
Um, yeah, I mean, are you asking like what kind of research would be like relevant to the public or?
Uh, to be honest, I have very little experience with writing in general and working on my theoretical publications. I was watching a movie, Inventing Anna, and they go really into the mind of the journalist and they show how the process of her research transforms into her publication. And that actually helped me to think through my own thinking process about writing. And I remember noting that her lived experiences became part of her research. What she learned through data, you know, took a certain piece in her like eventual writing, you know, at what get published. So sometimes I wonder, what do you want to present as your, like, should you kind of like harp down on your expertise or something that you formally studied, or should you focus on your experience with your particular subject? Or does it
Hmm.
make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And I think that the answer to that is it could be like either of those things. It depends on what you want to write. I didn't share any of these, but like when I was looking for examples of op-eds written by researchers, like some of them were written by researchers, but they were like largely about their personal experience, like somewhat bolstered by their work. But um, I think it just really depends on what it is you want to write about. And like if your personal experience or what you studied is like most relevant to that, like that's what you'll play up as your expertise. If it's a specific study you wrote and that's like why you're the right person, then that's what you want to mention. So it's pretty flexible and it just goes down to that question, I think, of, yeah, like why are you the right person to write this? And sometimes it's because you wrote a paper, or sometimes it's because like 10 years ago you studied this in school. Other times it's like, you know, yeah, I'm a researcher on this topic, and I'm also like a parent, and this issue is important to me as a parent because I have a kid in school. So any of those really work. So feel free to choose whatever, you know, kind of journey like most suits you.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, great. So let's all thank Colleen, and this is going to conclude the first half of this webinar. Colleen, you can feel free to sign off, and all of the rest of us, if you want to stay, great. And if you do, we're going to take a 10-minute break. So I'm going to turn my camera off. We'll come back at like 3:10-ish. And then we get a chance to talk to Cara and Dave about their experiences and hear their stories about doing this kind of work. For the rest of you, thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting this webinar series. It was great to see you all, and have a good rest of your day. All right, see you all in 10.
Thank you all.
The original idea was to split us up into two smaller groups, but I think we have a manageable size right now. And I like the idea of allowing Cara and Dave to sort of ping pong back and have more of a dialogic interaction with each other. So I think let's just stay in this one room. It's also better for me because I get to listen to both people rather than having to put myself in one breakout room versus another. So basically I just want to start by asking both of you to introduce yourselves and maybe ask maybe try to answer what's your history with doing this kind of writing, because I know both of you have done this kind of writing. And then also, if you could uh, answer or try to answer the question, what made you want to write for a larger public audience to begin with? And that's it.
You go first, Cara.
All right, thank you, Dave. So I am Cara Furman. I'm associate professor of early childhood education at Hunter. And so I see everything that I do really as working with the general public, because my students are going to be teachers, and they are mostly undergraduate or master's students, and then some doctoral students who often are working in the field as well. So why I wanted to write to the public, I guess, is because the thing that motivates my research is that I want to be improving teaching. And so even when I'm writing more academic pieces, I try to think about, like, could my students read this if they were so inclined? Even if they can't, like, would this matter that someone has read this? And so I'll just say really briefly, I have written for a variety of places. But the one that I write the most frequently for is Edutopia, because that is the one that's read by teachers and really about practice. And so that one's exciting for me. And then, as some of you know, I also do a podcast. And so that to me feels like really the primary way that I'm communicating with a wider public. So I will ping pong it to Dave.
Yeah, I'm Dave Backer. I'm an associate professor of education policy at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. I'm based now out of Brooklyn, New York. And let's see. I mean, I guess you could say I've always wanted the ideas that I was working on to have a sort of wide audience, just to, I don't know, writing for me was sort of a public act. But I think maybe the best way to characterize my approach to the whole thing is the fact that I've been pretty active on the left politically. And this sort of gets to maybe what Larry mentioned earlier, in the sense that on the left, but also being politically active general, there's always just a froth of takes, and people are trying to get their ideas into the mix, onto the terrain, because you want to illuminate, condense, help to understand, or help advance a certain tendency. And on the left, there's just a very long tradition of, like, the essay, the essay in the journal that does sort of an analysis that people can read and chat about. And so my first non-academic piece was even before I started doctoral work. While I was still a teacher, I wrote an N+1 about an Ecuadorian environmental policy, but an oil exploitation and stuff. And the reason I wanted to do that was because, I don't know, I wanted to participate in the general political project of making things for everyone and not ruining the environment. And so, and I guess I had what I've referred to in some cases as like various crushes on like outlets, whether they're websites or papers or journals or wherever. I'm just like, oh, I want to publish there, because for me it gives me a sense of like recognition, that this venue, that I could publish in that venue, but I also know that that venue has a certain kind of audience and a certain kind of reach, and that then corresponds to a certain kind of influence, that I would want a certain idea to have to be able to participate in the conversation. And since then, I've just tried to kind of follow my crushes to an extent and be like, oh, that place looks cool, that place looks cool. And it's gotten to the point and it's sort of a fantasy that I used to have, where people actually ask me to to write, because they want something for their audience. And yeah, I think I'll say also that more recently, my work has focused on school finance. And I feel like there's an element of that, particularly for us as philosophers, that like it's not just about a certain kind of writing, for a public audience, but what you're writing about, and what you choose to write about, what you're interested in. And I have found that after going very theoretical, I would say, just deep into kind of, Althusserian theories, for instance, that applying that theory to finance and trying to untangle it, people want to hear about that more than they want to hear about just straight Althusser, which I was happy to talk to anyone about because I spent 8 years writing a book about it. But the subject of finance is a way that I've found to talk about that philosophical theory in a way that people want to hear about, because it's pegged in a certain way to the subject of finance, but also because I just find the finance interesting. So yeah, I don't want to ramble about it. So Tyson, we're doing sort of a dialogue. Should I ask Cara something, and then Cara, like I don't know, maybe you want to say, how you like do the story of your first time doing this, what it was like, um, and for you, has anything surprised you in the process of doing a more public oriented kind of production?
Yeah, that's a good, interesting question. Um, I think my initial work was with Edutopia, and um, I think what surprised me, one of the things was the speed that Tyson highlighted, that like it can take forever for the pitch to get picked up, and then once they respond to you, like they want you to move really, really fast, and that is challenging. And so I now know that, so I really kind of write with the piece already written before I do the pitch, and then I just have a few knowing that it might be rejected from a bunch of places. I sort of like write something that I think can hit a few different audiences. So I think that kind of surprised me, and is important to highlight. I think, I think another part that we haven't talked about, so I did not create this for today, but I'll put it in the chat. I created this like a while ago. I have this like slideshow that might be helpful for folks. And if you go to slide 9, I ask sort of like, what's the best medium? I think that's like important for people to think about. Like, who do you want to talk to? What do you want to talk about? But also like, how do you communicate well? Like some of these places ask for stories, and some of them ask for a different kind of tone. And then like, how are you going to tell that story to draw in an audience? I have on slide 10. But the thing I wanted to draw your attention to actually, which I think I appreciate that Dave put this out there, in typical sort of like um, humble fashion, is that like this is also work that we, at least for those of us who are fairly junior, like we kind of have to do this now professionally to some degree too, or it really helps. And so the last slide I have sort of, this was when I did the first piece, so thanks Jay for the question, but I had this book that I had written. And the way I started writing it first was in articles. The articles is what allowed me to get the book deal essentially. And then I had to then sell the book after I had written it. And so I started doing blogs and podcast appearances and things like that. And so it's kind of this back and forth. And I think you can get very like demoralized by the sort of like seeing it as selling oneself. But advice that Rachel Wall gave me was like, you're not you're not pitching yourself. You're pitching, you did this because you think it matters. And so you're speaking to an audience for what really matters. And now at the end of the day, like a certain amount of people read the book, but actually like what people most read is like the article in Edutopia or the conversation. And so I find that really like meaningful to be able to like distill stuff that took a book to write into 850 words, which is how most people are going to interact with the project. I know Larry's like face plant. And that, I mean, as a scholar, that feels really counter. But on the other hand, like in a conversation, like if Dave and I are talking back and forth, like we're distilling the 1,000 things that are happening in our head to like a little bit of it so that we can be in conversation with others. So I think there's a way in which we work through it, to be very Arendtian, Larry. Like we work through it in our heads so that we can then see and be seen in public. And so both of those things I think matter. So maybe I'll pitch it to you, Dave, to say, you know, like how has this helped you intellectually to be doing this kind of work that isn't the kind of scholarship that you and I and Larry, you know, that all of us are also deeply committed to? How did the two work together?
Yeah. I had so for my dissertation, I studied classroom discussion, and I worked in a fourth grade classroom with my friend, my best friend from college, and I went into his classroom and I was there for for a year, like watching him try out the student-centered discussion models. And I remember him talking to me once, and he said, like academics, you go to outer space, and that's very far from where we all are. But like the stuff that you bring back is super helpful and interesting when you do, and he always, that image of going to outer space but then coming back, like always stuck with me in the sense that um what we're doing when we do intellectual like knowledge production as academics is we're basically like getting past the boundary of common sense, and we're going into the outer reaches, to come back with something, and we're producing something. And I think, to some degree, like that, we shouldn't have to think instrumentally about that. Like it's not as though you always have to think like, well, so what? I hate that. Like, and there's a bit of a pragmatism, in that question, which is cool. Like it should always cash out as something, and it should always lead to more things. But also I'm thinking like, I don't know. I don't, I never studied Kierkegaard very carefully, but the idea of the Knight of Faith always made a big impression on me, right? Which is that you go out, you go out really far, but you have to come back. And it's super important to come back. And like I think that it's, when you do come back, you get more ideas. Like you figure out, where you want to go next. In a way, maybe the space image isn't so relevant, in a sense that like coming back to Earth in this case should like actually help you conceive of how to do what you do when you go back out into space. I know for me, it's always been that way. Like, and it goes back to this sort of framework in my dissertation that I used and that I teach now from Nick Burbulis and Kathleen Knight Abowitz, their idea of situated philosophy. You know, like I take that very seriously in a sense, you know, that philosophy is always done by certain people in certain places for certain reasons, and that it's always it's always sort of embedded in a set of social practices. And I remember one time, I think it was like I was presenting on this as a grad student, and of course it was Chris Moffat, and he was sort of, I was sort of saying, I was sort of framing it as like, well, we like apply the theory to the thing, you know, and he pushed back on that and he said it's more like I think more like Demosthenes. He made a Demosthenes reference where there are mutual pressures. It's not as though we're applying the concepts to a reality that then the reality is illuminated. It's actually more that the reality has a kind of being and a pressure, and the concepts have a being and a pressure, and then they mutually go back and forth like that. I feel like I talk like this in this audience, you know. I can't really talk like that anywhere else. And so for me, that's how it's been. Like I'm trying to think of a really good example. But you know, I've found in finance, for instance, um, I have found so many instances of, you know, what I think to be concepts or ways in which the finance itself helps me understand concepts anew. So the example that I'm thinking of now is when I went, like, a lot of my more public stuff at the root of it has been a newsletter that I've written every week since 2020. And like this newsletter is sort of a public sort of notes in a way, like thoughts. It's like 500 words to 800 words every week I send out to the newsletter. You know, and at first it was nobody, like maybe 2 people subscribed, and now it's like 700 something. But you know, for that newsletter one time, I went as far as I could go into one single charter school's finances in Philadelphia. And I just wanted to understand. Like, I had no idea how this all works. I didn't think anyone else really understood either. And I had to go into like some bond documents and some disclosures and figure out exactly what the charter school was, like almost metaphysically, like what is this thing? And it turned out to be um, a series of like networked nonprofit and for-profit limited liability corporations, um, some of which owned some buildings and others of which didn't, some of which did the business on behalf of the school, and others of which actually literally in the bond documents, in the credit documents, it literally says, for the purposes of financial reasons, this LLC is not the school. However, for legal purposes, this entity is the school. and I was like, that's just post-modernity. I mean, that's just that's just literally like an aporia written into school literally an actually existing aporia where it is both a school and not a school. And I titled the series of blog posts, "This is not a school," but the "not" was in parentheses, like Derrida would do, you know. And like the you know, and understanding that, like, you know, that changed my whole understanding of postmodern thinking in a way, right? Like, it's not, postmodernity isn't this some like, oh, you know, like all the, you know, everyone would say, like with the Sokol affair, and oh, it's just navel gazy, doesn't make any sense, what does this even do? Like, actually no, in the realities of school finance you find these aporias. And that, you know, I don't know, so there's this dual pressure, right? Like, it's not like, you know, like, so the theory, the stuff that I was writing about would then teach me about the theories. And then the other thing, I guess, that I'll say is like, I've found that I have more, particularly in this age, which is more dominated by the image and the voice than it is by the written word. We're sort of really moving away from the written word as a predominant communication, in terms of, like, I've become very active on TikTok and making videos. I have more sympathy for Socrates' critiques of writing. And there's this book that I think it's called and I brought this up in a session with Eduardo actually at the last PES. Iris Murdoch has a book, I think it's called The Sun and somebody knows what book I'm talking
Fire
about.
in the Sun.
The
It's
Fire in the
Fire
Sun,
in-
yes. You read that book and you get this, she does this very, very deep reading of these issues and the relationship of the concept to the word. And I think she ends, Larry, maybe you could correct me or somebody correct me. I think she ends up in that book having kind of having like a sympathy for the voice and the relationship of philosophy to the spoken voice, the immediate spoken voice. And I don't know, I guess it sort of showed me about that doing this kind of work. Okay, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Great. So let's open it up. Who has a question? And also, Larry already demonstrated this in the larger group, but if you're working on something and have a pressing, urgent, I don't know, something that you're really doing and you need feedback, you need input from Cara or Dave, then this is the time to ask. Anastasia? Unmute. Need to unmute.
Sorry, I have technical issues today. I'm on the phone. Okay, I have a question to follow up with your beautiful expose of, how philosophical tangents and going far into the ether of reality and coming back, like how it can inform the actual, lived practice in this push and pull. And to tie it back to the previous Kara's conversation about, writing and pitching specifically. So I'm going to try to formulate it as a very clear question, but just bear with me for a second. Next semester, I have to be teaching on self-branding and entrepreneurship within an interdisciplinary design practice. So I come from a architectural and visual background. So I have, I'm a self-employed artist primarily, and a self-employed architectural designer. And I've been writing for the last, I don't know, maybe, 2.5 years. So it's fairly new for me, but I enjoy it very much. And now meditating on how will I be teaching this class, something that Cara said really stuck with me, that, you do not want to be, just you don't want to overexpose people to everything that's going on in your mind, right? Or the entire experience of your ether, when you're over there in the outer spaces of reality, because for an artist, that is the same experience as for a philosophical thinker. You go somewhere and a lot of your experience does not relate to general public in any way. However, though, you have to come back and ground it somehow and make it, enter into dialogue with actual people that speak some actual language, for financial reasons and also just not to go insane. So I'm trying to formulate this for my students as to how can they present themselves. So instead of branding yourself like the freaking like a TikTok thing, where you put what you eat for dinner and how you dress your kids and how you decorate your house and the shit that nobody needs to know anymore. I think we've seen enough of it. But how do you ground it in a particular question so that they can actually pitch themselves, right? Through a specific philosophical lens to allow people to see their value and the value of their ether experiences. I think this is as clear as I can formulate it. I hope this is, I hope you understand where I'm going. And if possible, I would like to hear feedback from both Cara and David.
You want to go first, Cara? I talked a lot.
Can you phrase that part of it about the the exact question part of it again? I think
Okay. The exact question is, because your experiences are very diverse from mine, I would like to hear some thoughts or tips or advices as to how to help students
got it.
to channel their stuff, through a specific, question or thesis or lands, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, so very practically, I do this sometimes with students, with doctoral students, where we'll play with um like, well, I play this like cocktail party game, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to tell you who you're about to talk to. You have to find a way to get your research to be valuable to that person. So what's the angle and what's the pitch to that person? So like they'll get up and I'll be like, okay, you're talking to your mother, like, or someone's mother, like somebody who cares, who like isn't really informed on this topic. Like, how at Thanksgiving are you going to tell the story of like why this matters to who? Like, what way are you going to tell this story? Okay, now you're talking to like somebody at a conference at an elevator who you want to impress, like who knows a lot about this topic. Like, how are you going to like tell that story to the person? Well, okay, now you've met someone at a conference who knows nothing about your topic and they don't care about it, but they're a fellow academic. Like, how are you going to like tell them? And they like literally go from person to person in the room and they like retell the pitch kind of over and over. So that's just like one way that I think helps people think about it. I think also I often ask students to start with the personal, but then move away from it. So like really, if you get deep down, like why does this thing matter? Like what is the story of like this thing? Like there is a thing that is guiding this work. Like what is at the heart? And you don't have to even tell me that thing, or it might be private, but know that for yourself. Like where does this come from, kind of, and then how do you then turn it around, and what part of that story do you want to share with others to show them why it matters too. And I think a similar exercise really helps me for others like in the room to think about, like, if I'm pitching this to like to the conversation, I asked myself a similar question, which was like, there's a lot I could say right now, but like, what is really truly driving this? And then how do I tell that story to somebody who doesn't, I mean, in that case, it was to somebody who doesn't care. Like they're not interested in this story. So, and I guess the last thing I'll say about this, which is not your question, but I think it matters. Colleen was saying, that piece that I did for the conversation got a lot of traction. She was like, yeah, I bet it got a lot of like interest, which it did. Like I could see it moving along because you can see the metrics of how things are picked up. But she said, did you get a lot of media requests for it? And I said, no, I got one. And which was, a lot for me, but not a lot. And I said, I don't know if people care that much about like things that hurt like teachers. Like, I don't think the American public is that concerned about what happens to like young women in the classroom. And so why am I telling this? Because I have to think about why it matters to me. I care about young women in the classroom. And then I have to think about, well, what matters to the American public? Well, the American public is very concerned about like censorship, for example, or things like that. And so this is also an issue of politics in those ways too. So it's sort of like, how do I spin this story and tell it? So not just to be like a marketer, because that makes me uncomfortable, but how do I tell this story so that people actually will hear it and care about it? So that sort of answered your question, and then it went beyond it, I think, a little bit to some other places.
Actually, is it okay if I follow up with what you just said? It's very interesting for me in terms of how can you help students kind of decipher between, when do you maintain integrity to your own interests to develop in the intellectual direction or practices that you feel are, like research, right? Like that's what you want to research versus, how do you make it more palatable for consumption? Like how to strike that balance between consumability, but at the same time without like, kind of like intellectually prostituting yourself.
I mean, I'll really briefly say something that I know Dave has stuff to say on this one, but I think you always maintain intellectual integrity to what you're doing. And that's certainly what my doctoral advisor, David Hansen, was like. You tell the story and do the research that matters to you. The next iterations of how it gets shared with the public, that's where you start to think about like, well, how do I share this story with these different audiences? But I don't believe in being like, I'm not a confidence man. Like, I don't I'm not selling something to sell it. I am really very deeply committed to a set of ideals, and everything I write is about those things. And then it's just, how do I get other people sort of interested in that thing because I care about it? So I think I would burn out very quickly as a scholar, and I don't think I would be very successful if I was just trying to get the tagline. Yeah, David.
Thank you.
Let me just make sure I have your question right before I answer it. So you're sort of interested in, like, you're teaching these students, and you're sort of interested in, like, that action of, like, taking these ideas where you're kind of out in space and then you bring them back, and, like, how to do that. And then in the sort of follow-up question, you're kind of asking about, like, threats to the integrity of the project because of its kind of selling, aspect. It's commodification, and it's
Yeah.
both in the attention economy and in the real economy. You can make money. Plenty of people make tons of money spouting bullshit. Excuse my language. So I think I don't. I don't. It's such a good question about how, like, how to advise someone in, they're working on this project, and these things that nobody can really make sense of, or it's only makes sense to them, and then how to sort of fit that through the relatively narrow aperture of these different audiences and these different media.
Can I specify, just to make maybe your job of answering a little bit
Sure,
easier?
please.
Let's keep it short because there's other people that might have questions. So I want to keep it.
Yes.
I want to make sure there's more space for other voices.
I have to be teaching this class specifically within the entrepreneurship context. So the focus has to be on entrepreneurship. However, I'm within the position of, I am a PhD student myself. So it's like a lot to think through. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, like, I definitely I can feel the entrepreneurialism of the self, as my understanding of Foucault talked about. I can literally feel myself doing that. And what I tell myself to some degree is, like, to be out there in these different arenas and these different apparatuses and these different terrains, is that, like, it's sort of like like Cara said, but in a more specific way. It's like I'm advancing a kind of concept, and I want that concept to be able to have potency, to be able to, I feel like I'm playing Jenga, and I have to be able to find the place where I want to move, and I got to make that move. And right now, there's just this sort of slew of choreographies you have to participate in, to be able to do that in a public way. And I don't know, I found it fun, to try to translate these things. I guess I think it's fun to, like, figure out ways of communicate. It's part of teaching to some degree, is figuring out ways of communicating complex things to people so that you can get them to have a new idea or something. But yeah, I think there's a lot of, stuff you have to do to maintain your own sense of integrity and the integrity of the concept so they don't get watered down.
Thank you for that. It's interesting that we're so concerned about loss of integrity when we write op-eds, but not when we write for, like, academic journals, which I also feel often compromise my integrity. Anyways, how about other questions from the audience or comments? Great. Felice, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
Felice, okay, please.
Okay. Yeah, actually, this is a little bit comment and the question specifically for writing to the general audience part. But I'm coming from the field directly for the decades of teaching and administration in another context, in Turkey. But the reason I'm coming back to academy is to understand or to explain the problems in a more theoretical way. But also, I am so I felt so disappointed with this division between the theory and practice thing, or between the philosophy and the schools thing, or the field things. It's like someone just divided like Descartes, and then no one can bring them together. Like we separated body and mind together, and now we don't know how to bring all these things together, kind of question. And it is, I'm sorry, but it is ridiculous, because what we should be doing is to make the things easier on school side, or make the improvement on what's going on in education and real education. But anyway, my question is, when writing to the general audience like that, I have a personal standpoint and experiences, and tons of experiences, and now the theoretical part. But while writing, for example, Cara, you said that I was a teacher, a classroom teacher, at some point, and you used your experience as a kind of empirical evidence or support, right? So while writing this, should I try to find a real qualitative research to make my point as supported with evidence, or where are my personal experiences without turning them into real scientific research? How should I bring my things into my writing as a real support evidence for my points?
So I think it depends a little bit on your audience. So I
Sorry.
think I I think that I was saying in the chat, like I recently wrote something on Facebook about Tylenol and pregnancy. If I was gonna share that, I think an audience I could share that is maybe like the parents page of the New York Times or something like that. I could try to like write it up for that. And in that, I would sort of tell this anecdote, but then I would bring in my anecdote about Tylenol actually tells us nothing really meaningful about Tylenol, except for that it like draws people into the story. The real evidence is that like what the doctors have found about the relationship between Tylenol and pregnancy and autism. So I might use that as a hook, again, the fifth grade writing, like that's my hook. But the real story is actually like what the American Academy of Pediatrics has like discovered about Tylenol and pregnancy. But I knew on my Facebook page, so I did link that real story, but I knew on my page that people probably hadn't thought a lot about the role of Tylenol in pregnancy if they were not actually very sick when they were pregnant. And so I felt like my personal story would be able to sort of like matter to people and draw them into that account. So I think I happen to do qualitative research, and so I can draw somewhat on my own, but I think the empirical work backs it up. It makes it more than just an anecdote. I think that it might be good to like look at thinkers like Sarah Stitzland's work, because she really doesn't do a lot of empirical work, and so she's drawing her evidence in a different way than I personally would as well. I also put in the chat, I know we're kind of getting close to the hour before turning it to Dave or to somebody else for a question. I put in the chat, I have like a post that's sort of like key things for translating your work like as a philosopher into it being accessible to other people. And so I shared that. It's like a handout, which people seem to find helpful. So it just do's and don'ts kinds of things.
Dave, do you want to respond?
I mean, I think Cara said it well. I want to make sure if someone else too has a question, maybe we can get that in.
Does anyone else have a question? Great, Addie.
Hi, everybody. I'm interested, especially because both of you have such a good handle on this, I feel, that in speaking in a public context, there's the kind of unpleasant task of telling people things in not, maybe it's the thing that they want to hear, but not in the way that they want to hear it, or to interject into the assumptions, even the assumptions that are, in line politically or philosophically or whatever, where you just have to kind of complicate it. And I'm wondering if you have advice for how to go about that kind of interjection.
Like when you want to tell someone they're wrong, or that they're not looking at a thing, or they don't understand, something like that is what you mean.
Like that there are certain kind of ways of talking about particular topics can develop into this like very binary approaches, and the kind of like intellectual task seems to be to stop thinking about it in that way. And that requires, so because I also write a newsletter for community context, and there's a lot of like political things happening, and strong feelings, and even if I want to kind of affirm certain things, I need to be careful about not playing into bigger topics. I don't know, I'm being vague, too vague here, but I don't feel like I can summarize an example easily.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, in some ways, I'm hearing in your question, like, how do you do this, and how do you wade into controversy? What do you do about wading into controversy? But also, when you want to break through the common sense, how do you do it? And yeah, I mean, I feel like, I mean, part of the magic of philosophy, to some degree, right, is almost like to conjure this kind of new understanding out of the existing set of materials, something that kind of wasn't there before. And I feel like one of the things that always drew me to philosophy was that sort of like presto kind of moment. And I think creating those kinds of moments are, a way of doing this. And I typically like, I mean, to me, it always appears. I see it as a word. Like if someone's saying something, then I think of I don't know what it is, but having studied philosophy and mathematics as an undergraduate, load-bearing variables in terms and predicates. I feel like I zero in on a particular word that someone's used in a particular way, and I try to respond in a way that uses that word in the way that the concept twists or changes, like, because behind words are concepts, and but every word in that way is a sort of terrain of struggle between the different concepts that are sort of fighting for hegemony over what the concept of that word is going to be, whether it's equality or equity or justice or civil rights. Right now in civil rights, we have a federal Department of Education that thinks of civil rights as redounding to white South Africans, not black South Africans, for instance. So taking up the word and trying to use that word in the context that's going to make the twist, the moment. That's what philosophy does. So, I mean, in some ways, I have a very ambivalent relationship with controversy. On the one hand, I'm very afraid of confrontation. But on the other hand, I want to blow up all the things. Like I want to cause as much of it as possible, or I want to be contrarian or reverse as many things as I can, because I really enjoy the sensation of engaging in that. And so maybe figuring out how to navigate those kinds of waters. Sometimes I've stepped in it. Sometimes I've kicked over, the hornet's nest or whatever. But I heard recently somebody say that, like, one of the best ways to get, an idea out there or to message is controversy. So, there's this idea of all media, no media is bad media, or no coverage is bad coverage. I mean, to some degree, if you're causing some controversy, you've hit upon a thing, a tension point, and you engage in that tension point as you can, and then you can use your tools to do that. And in some ways, that's a form of the public intellectual work.
Cara, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I guess I approach it pretty differently, so maybe that's also worth hearing. I have always felt like my work was about anti-racist work, like that's why I do it, but that isn't always the language that I've used. And that wasn't always helpful to me, like, but now it is helpful to me because it allows me to continue to like be talking about things in a wider range of spaces. So I've thought a lot about like how much do I want to connect the dots between censorship of teachers and censorship. And there was a point historically where I was like, yeah, I want to connect the dots. Why isn't anyone talking about this connection? And now I'm like, don't really need to connect those dots. But if we had more freedom in the classroom, like, you know, in the ways that I'm calling for around curriculum and fidelity, like we would actually have a lot less censorship of other things too. And so I kind of go in through the back and I sort of don't court controversy. I think about like what is the way in which my neighbor or my, you know, the woman in the kids soccer team who follows me on Facebook is going to be able to kind of like get behind these ideas and listen. And maybe think a little bit differently about like say Tylenol or something like that.
We're running out of time. Does anyone have another question? A short one? I have a question. I'm dying to ask it. So I'm sorry, I'm abusing my power here, but I can't resist. And
You're using it. You're using it.
yeah, I'm using it. Hopefully for the benefit of everybody. But I'm curious, like there's been this dialogue started with the division between sort of academic work and like public facing work and other divisions that make us feel like somehow when we do this we are, I don't know, losing our identities or commercializing ourselves or commodifying ourselves and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just wondering if as what you think about this, like teaching a class, for instance, of looking at philosophers who were public intellectuals and how they did this writing. And I'm thinking going all the way back to Kant in the essay, What is Enlightenment? That was written for a newspaper. Hannah Arendt, Adi will love this, right? Hannah Arendt, a great public intellectual who wrote for mass audiences, or, Cornel West. Like, if we could put together like a lineage of this and show that this work is not outside of philosophy, but actually inside of philosophy, internal to philosophy itself, as a pedagogical project, maybe it would make more philosophers interested in doing this work.
I mean, I think that the image of the forum, and I've written about this before, the image that's so famous that we had in the philosophy ed department at TC, where they're all like these men just like wandering through like empty streets, like has done a disservice to philosophy. I'll end it with that because that's actually Plato was like in the town and it was like messy and loud and it was a port. Like that's not what he was walking through. So I like to be in the port.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, like philosophy is as such was sort of born there, and to some degree there's something kind of elemental about philosophy that we're talking about. But I think perhaps because of its instantiation as a discipline and then the history of that discipline and then the responsibilities and requirements or expectations of publication and discourse siloization and stuff, like it's become this alienating thing that you're talking about, Tyson, and maybe what we're talking about here is trying to reconnect with that elemental thing. But in some ways, it's hard to describe for the same reason, because of that distance.
Well, you have both inspired me to return to the roots of what philosophy really is and write an op-ed. So thank you so much. This has been a true pleasure. I hope all of you enjoyed this, and let's just thank our panelists for a delightful conversation and a great way to spend an afternoon. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I'm going to now conclude the first installment of our webinar series, and hopefully we will do this again, and I will see all of your faces another time in the near future. Excellent. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.